Hello and welcome. Whether you're here in person in Edinburgh City Chambers or you're online, you're equally welcome to this event. I'm Stuart Brown, I'm the interim CEO of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership. Friends online, please feel welcome to introduce yourselves in the chat function on Zoom. The Scotland-Malawi Partnership is a membership network which exists to support, connect and represent the many individuals and organisations in Scotland who have dignified people-to-people links with Malawi. We have a sister organisation in Malawi, the Malawi-Scotland Partnership. We're funded by, but independent of, the Scottish Government. A few housekeeping notes. The meeting's being recorded and will go online. And at the risk of sounding litigious, we take your continuing participation in this meeting as you're consenting to be part of that recording. After the event, we'll put the links to the presentations online and share these with you by email. We post the chat log online as well, where messages that are sent to everybody in this meeting are shared. If you have any direct contact messaging in the chat function, those online, these are not shared, so please take a note of that yourselves. For those online, it would be great if you please appear under your own name rather than that of the device that you're using. And we'd ask you to remain muted, please, until invited to speak in the Q&A sessions. And if you'd then please unmute yourself. If possible, when speaking, if you'd please switch on your video. We realise that that can be a drain on data, but enables our audiovisual system, our OWL, to focus on you. You're very welcome to live tweet during this meeting. The social media handles are shown on the screen and in chat. So to today's meeting, Lessons from the Lake. It's a project which sets out to understand the history of fisheries management in Lake Malawi, into which it takes a deep dive. The longitudinal study takes a multidisciplinary approach and is a collaborative project between the University of Strathclyde and Mzuzu University. It's funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Natural Environment Research Council. To tell us more and to lead us through the presentations, please welcome Dr. David Wilson, who is Principal Investigator in the project and Lecturer in History at the University of Strathclyde. David.
Good. Hi everyone, in room and online. My name is Dr. David Wilson. I am a historian at the University of Strathclyde. I acted as the principal investigator on the Lessons from Lake Malawi project. Before we move on to the presentation itself, I would like to first thank the Scotland-Malawi Partnership for organising and hosting this event, and for the support of this project over the lifetime of the project, which has been much appreciated, and it's been a great chance to engage with the organisation as well. So thank you very much. By ways of an introduction, I think the slides are coming up here. Yep. By ways of an introduction, our project, the Lessons from Lake Malawi, focused on the history of colonialism and fisheries governance in Lake Malawi, investigating the development of centralised fisheries governance in Lake Malawi under the British colonial regime from the 1930s to the 1960s, in comparison to the emergence of a chief regulated fishery at Mbenji Island, which was instituted in the same decades in response to similar concerns over the growing intensity of fishing efforts in the lake in the first half of the 20th century. Our aim was to consider how these two governance systems has led to distinctive fisheries management regimes underpinned by specific knowledges, principles and ideologies which continue to this day. The project was a collaborative effort between Mzuzu University and Mzuzu Malawi, the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland, and the Centre for Environmental Policy and Advocacy in Blantyre, Malawi. Our team, who you can see on the screen here, was comprised of historians, scientists and policy experts. And drawing on this expertise, our research had three main components. First was the archival research, which focused on understanding the emergence of centralised fisheries governance in the mid-20th century by examining the surviving colonial documentation, including reports, surveys and legislation focused on the lake fisheries. We also looked at fisheries legislation and policy reports from the point of independence in 1964 to the present day. Our second component was to conduct oral histories in order to explore the history of fisheries management at Benji Island, understanding the origins, motivations and development of the Benji Island fisheries governance regime. Finally, our third component focused on environmental sampling in order to understand the environmental context in which these regimes were operating, and crucially to assess the impact and legacies of these regimes on fishing resources in the regions. We also conducted sediment analysis to gain a sense of environmental pollution in key parts of the lake near to Benji Island as well. Today, you'll hear from different members of the team who will talk through the key findings from the different parts of this research, and we will also present on some of our preliminary recommendations based on this collective work, which we suggest can offer important lessons and reflections for the future of fisheries governance, not just in Lake Malawi, but also beyond. There will then be plenty of time for questions and discussions thereafter, and we would love to hear from all of you, from your thoughts, your reflections and your feedback on this quite unique project. I think you'll agree. So to turn first, this moves on. So Chan, can you?
I meant this way.
Oh.
Who said, works fine, practice.
Yep. We did practice this, but we're just having a bit of difficulty moving the slide on, so just give us a wee second there. While you move on, I'll just continue. There we go. Oh, cool. Okay. So to turn first to the history of colonial fisheries governance, the central findings from archival research was that the origins of colonial interventions in the lake fisheries began in the 1930s in response to the expansion of non-African fishing efforts in the southeast of Lake Malawi, which caused conflicts when non-African fishing infringed on African fishing grounds. This led to the passage of a series of fishing rules which focused on regulating non-African fishers, requiring them to gain fishing permits. These permits also required the return of information to the government surrounding fishing efforts and catches in the lake. This was an important source of data, but such data was effectively meaningless without parallel studies of fish biology, behaviours, recruitment and overall stock health in the lake, alongside a deeper understanding of fluctuating lake conditions and the resultant impact on fish populations. The need for such information then motivated 3 fisheries surveys led by British fisheries scientists between 1939 and 1955, each of which provided an assessment of fishing stocks and fishing efforts in the lake, while advancing recommendations for the regulated development of lake fisheries. Collectively, the surveys focused on recommendations that would lead to attaining the maximum sustainable yield. That is the maximum yield of fish that could be harvested each year from the lake without damaging the fish stocks there. Each survey recommended that this could only be achieved through greater oversight and control by the British colonial administration. Of particular concern were the findings of the second survey, conducted by Rosemary Lowe between 1945 and 1947, and focused predominantly on the important tilapia fisheries, which are known locally as chambo, in the southeast of the lake. In her report, Lowe suggested that the chambo fisheries were already being fished to their utmost limit. There was a danger that these were already being overfished. While recommending greater centralised management and oversight, each report emphasised that a much greater volume of data surrounding fishing efforts and yields, as well as fish habits and biology, was required to inform any management decisions. Such an approach centred fisheries management on assessing the stocks of single species, mainly chambo stocks, by monitoring fishing efforts, biological indicators, and the volume of fish being caught each season. This was in line with the dominant ideas emerging within the burgeoning field of fisheries science in the mid-century. Importantly, although each survey team engaged with and relied on the ideals, information and knowledge of African fishers with varying levels of recognition in their subsequent reports, none of the reports advanced any recommendations or discussion surrounding the existing protocols and regulations governing African fisheries in the lake. Rosemary Lowe was particularly concerned that regulations being made over the lake by 2 separate groups, that is by the government and by lakeshore leaders, hindered the potential to develop a unified fisheries policy, which would then cause difficulties with the future envisioned development of large-scale African fisheries. As such, she recommended that, quote, the easiest way to make the fullest use of all the fish stocks on a long-term basis would probably be by having unified and government control over all separate fisheries, end quote. This meant that fishers' knowledge was being folded into scientific reports, which were then being used to inform regulatory regimes that those fishers were not involved in leading or advising on. Based on these recommendations, the final 2 decades of colonial rule witnessed the creation of a patchwork regime of fisheries regulation and monitoring. For the most part, restrictive regulations targeted the expanding non-African fishing firms. In response to Low's concern of overfishing, a 1-month closed season was imposed on non-African fishers targeting chambo in the southeast arm every December, when they were not allowed to fish for chambo. By 1960, a decline in catches suggested that this had not had the desired effect, and so the closed season was extended to include November as well. In contrast to this regulation, there was a continued reluctance by the colonial administration to include or introduce any restrictions on African fisheries. Instead, colonial administrators concentrated on trying to assess their effort and scope, and also introducing limited schemes aimed at technology transfer and commercial guidance. When it came to assessing African fishing efforts, the capacity to observe only a limited number of beaches meant that the administration could only ever provide a vague suggestion of the potential overall effort, the overall scope of African fisheries. Even these limited estimations were found to be serious underestimates later on. Importantly, these underestimations occurred at a time when African fisheries were also undergoing significant changes from the 1930s onwards, as African fishers responded to the same commercial opportunities as non-African fishing firms. While the colonial administration attempted to divide fisheries along racialised lines, this ignored the hybridity of the burgeoning fishing trade, in which fish caught by African and non-African fisheries entered local, urban and export markets through connected lakeshore and roadside networks. Through these sometimes competing and sometimes collaborative networks, both African and non-African fishers increased their fishing efforts, adapted and adopted new fishing technologies, and extended the distribution of their harvests throughout the century. At the point of independence in 1964, a patchy and fragmented centralised fisheries governance regime had been instituted over Lake Malawi. The primary focus of centralised fisheries management was on monitoring and regulating the harvest of a single species, that is the chambo, using limited data and with a special concentration on non-African efforts through regulations on fishing gears, fishing nets, and using closed seasons. The vast majority of the lake fisheries, meanwhile, remained outside the immediate purview, monitoring and enforcement of the centralised administration, in which new and adapted fishing technologies were being tried, tested and disseminated by African fishers throughout the lake. For the first 3 decades following independence, the newly created Fisheries Department continued to operate along these lines. Importantly though, regulations on fishing gears and closed seasons surrounding chambo fisheries were then expanded to include African fishing efforts. This led to a series of conflicts and growing violence between fishers and government enforcement agents until the collapse of the National Single-Party Government in 1993. That same year, the chambo stocks of Lake Malawi also collapsed, highlighting the failure of the centralised management regime to sustain fisheries in practice. This failure, paired with external donor pressure, led to a turn to participatory fisheries management in the 1990s, which aimed to delegate fisheries management responsibilities to fishing communities. As it has elsewhere, participatory management has faced a series of challenges that has led to highly variable success rates at empowering fishers and communities. One of the central issues, though, is that participatory management regimes have been designed at a government level and through external consultation, but without any real consideration for existing customary structures and local power realities on the ground. In practice, the emphasis of governmental fisheries enforcement and resources remains largely concentrated on the southern chambo fisheries and the annual close season. Meanwhile, since the beginnings of centralised fisheries management emerged in the colonial period, there has remained only limited engagement with and support of existing regulatory regimes and institutions throughout the lake. This has resulted in institutional barriers and obstructions to genuinely participatory management, but has also crucially meant that a source of knowledge and partnership has too often been sidelined, neglected, or undermined. And now we'll turn to the oral history part of our research, which is presented by Professor Bryson Comer from Mizzou University. Just for the sake of connectivity and bandwidth, this is a pre-recorded presentation, so on the next slide, you should hear an audio file play. Just let us know if you have any issues hearing that.
Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bryson Comer from Mizzou University in Malawi. I'm one of the co-PIs in this project. My responsibility at this point is to give you a brief history of Mbenje Island fisheries management. Then after that, we can continue with the discussion. The information for this history was collected from oral histories, which we conducted with elderly people from Mbenje, including Chief Makanjira. The idea was to understand the origins and the history of Mbenje fisheries management. We also attended opening and closing ceremonies where speeches about the origins and progress of Mbenje fisheries management are shared. The information was tabulated, and we have used this information to construct the history of Mbenje fisheries management. On the origins, we noted that Mbenje started in the 1950s by two prominent fishers from Likoma, Mr. Karemba Asani and Mr. Kampunga. Let's bear in mind that Likoma is one of the islands on Lake Malawi where a lot of fishing takes place, and these are experts. Prior to this, Mbenje communities practiced localized fishing using Mbeza and Miono fishing gears. But these prominent fishers noted the existence at Mbenje of large quantities of utaka and other species such as Kampango, and these were in high demand in the urban centers, the key urban centers of Malawi, that is Blantyre and Lilongwe. For those who are not aware, Lilongwe is the capital of Malawi, the capital city of Malawi, and Blantyre is a main commercial city of Malawi. And this is where fish are in high demand. It has created a big market for fish in Malawi. Chief Makanjira granted the two fishers land for settlement, and when they settled, they started fishing at Mbenje Island. Now, as fishing expanded, Chief Makanjira established regulatory laws for fishing and settlement. According to him, this was an idea of conservation. They didn't want people to overfish, and which will result into the depletion of fish in the area. Two committees were instituted to enforce the rules among the fishers. There is a main committee which is traditionally chaired by senior group village headman Mr. Nyanguru, while the subcommittee currently is chaired by Mr. Balabado. The main committee is the overall in charge of Mbenje fisheries management, while the subcommittee is responsible for the day-to-day operations of fishing at Mbenje Island. Now, some of the regulatory laws that have been established by Chief Makanjira include the total closure of the island for 4 months for settlement and fishing. Between the month of December and April, Mbenje fishery is completely closed. People are not allowed to settle there. Fishing is not allowed to be done there. And they institute some police people to patrol the area of any kind of illegal fishing. The other one is prohibition of use of lamps and fishing gears of more than 2 inches. And those who are found offending, violating, and doing some illegal fishing are severely punished. They also offer sacrifices, especially before the opening of Mbenje in April. They believe that for them to be successful, they need the goodwill of their ancestral spirits. So that's why they conduct they offer some sacrifices. And the opening and closing ceremonies are done with pomp at Mbenje. There is a lot of celebration, eating, and so on. There are also some human relations regulations, such as prohibition of beer drinking, smoking, and killing of animals. Women are not allowed to go to Mbenje. And there are so many beliefs that are associated with Mbenje Island, that if you offend, if you violate the rules and the regulations, you are confronted with some ghosts in that area. So that is also adding value. But let's bear in mind that closure of Mbenje is a major law, and it allows for multiple fish breeding, concentration of fishers in agriculture, and it also works for the security of the fishers at Mbenje, because Mbenje experienced terrible thunders during the rain season. And this, I think, can also be compared with the government area, where closing is only for 2 months, October and November, and then it's open. And generally at Mbenje, it's total closure. No kind of fishing is allowed. But in the government side, there is some kind of fishing which is allowed, except the fishing of chambo. Now, since 1990, government recognized Mbenje fisheries regime as part of the decentralization. Let's bear in mind that even during the colonial period, the government was not aware, was not part of Mbenje fisheries management. And when we got independence, until 1990, Mbenje was operating independent from government, was not recognized. So it took the wisdom of the current Chief Makanjira to negotiate with government so that Mbenje is part of the decentralization process. And this had a very big advantage because after democracy, the issue of human rights were very popular and the courts were empowered. So the chief didn't want to do something that would take him to court. So that's why they negotiated work with government. And since then, fisheries officials, together with the police, are the ones who are engaged in confiscating illegal gears based on the act, the Fishing Act of Malawi. They also collect some fishing fees from Mbenje. But due to lack of finance, these officials have been unable to call out some statistics about Mbenje. So we are not very clear on how much fish is collected from Mbenje. But what they have done is to develop some bylaws to guide fisheries management at Mbenje. But let me conclude by saying that there is testimony, there is evidence that Mbenje fisheries management is one of the most successful fisheries management in Malawi. This has been testified by the chief himself, by the committee, and also the communities around. And most importantly, it has also been testified by fisheries officials, including the director of fisheries in Malawi, that when they compare with other stratas, other places, Mbenje is producing a lot of fish of good quality. And we can attribute this to the charismatic leadership of Chief Makanjira, strict regulations of the fisheries in the area, plus the traditional beliefs that are observed there to help in enforcing compliance among the fishers of Mbenje Island. So briefly, this is what I can say about the history of Mbenje fisheries management. I thank you very much for your attention. All the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Bryson. And I should say Bryson is in the chat as well, so he'll be here for the Q&A also. As well, Dr. Elias Churwa, who you're going to hear from next on the environmental sampling.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Elias Chirwa from Zozo University. I am going to present to you the findings or results of a research that we carried out in Lake Malawi at Mbenje Island in Salima district. The title of that presentation is Fisheries Analysis in Mbenje and Surrounding Waters. Now, at Mbenje Island and the surrounding waters, there are two types of fisheries governance schemes that are running. One is under the control of government, which is based mainly on the Western science and Western laws, which we inherited from the British colonial government way back in time. The other is the traditional fisheries management scheme, which is managed by the chiefs, the local chiefs, of course, with the help of their fishing communities and then fishing committees. Now, these two fisheries management schemes are somewhat different in terms of the authorities and in terms also of their outlooks and management activities. Even if they both respond to similar concerns of trying to avert or to prevent or reduce overfishing, or indeed trying to restore the fish stocks that have been deemed to have been overfished. Now, for several years or decades, we as Malawians and also the international organizations have been hearing rumors that the fisheries resources under the traditional management scheme at Mbenje Island are performing better, or in other words, they are healthier than the fish stocks which are under the control of government. And so we've been wondering how possible that could be, if indeed is true, because there has been no scientific documentation to try to corroborate that rumor that has been circulating around for several years and several decades. And so the two research objectives that we had were to assess the water quality conditions between the government-controlled areas and the Benji traditional fisheries management scheme. Also, we had to compare the health of the fish stocks at Benji and the government-controlled areas. The fish that we had targeted were the Utaka, the Copper species, which were the dominant fishes that were caught by the fishermen at that study site. And so we did water quality sampling, and we took several samples. You can see the picture on the left, research officers taking the water samples. And you can see down below that, on the left, also we have scientists taking fish samples and measuring for their total length, body weight, as well as length-weight relationships. The results that we got from that is that in terms of water quality, there were no significant differences between the various fishing strata. As you can see in the first table, in the last column, we have the p-values there, which are all greater than 0.05, implying that there were no statistically significant differences in terms of water quality among the
Oh, was that? Yeah, no.
I controls, and so it probably paused the audio.
Okay, I can
various
quickly see.
fishing strata that we had sampled. In the table below, and the figures of the fish to the right hand side, we can see that the fish in the government-controlled areas were slender and were much lighter than the fish in the traditional fisheries management scheme in Benji, even if these fish were of the same length. The meaning for this is that the fish stocks at Benji Island are healthier than the fish in the government-controlled fisheries. Not because of differences or variations in terms of water quality, because we found that there were no differences at all in terms of water quality in the different fishing strata, but rather these differences could be accounted for by the nature of the fisheries management occurring in the government areas and in the traditional fisheries management areas at Benji. The differences range from length of the close season. We see that in terms of length of close season, in the government-controlled areas, the fisheries are closed only for 2 months, whereas they're closed for a lot longer, twice as much longer in the traditional fisheries management scheme in Benji, 4 months. But also we see that in the government-controlled areas, the closed season only target to manage the jumbo fish species, but the closed season in Benji Island actually target to manage all the fish stocks. So this is what we see, and we see that we can learn something from this, namely that the communities can take better charge of their fisheries resources when given a proper chance, with government, of course, providing the support that the communities need in order to manage their resources better. And this, we think that it is an important lesson that we can learn from the Benji and surrounding waters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elias. I'm now going to pass over to Professor Tracy Morse to talk you through creating pollutants in the sediments.
Thank you. And for that, I give the caveat that I'm presenting the piece of work done by our colleague Charles Knapp, who couldn't make it today. So please keep all your hard questions for Charles. So just like Elias has talked about, as well as doing the water quality sampling and looking at the fish, we also took sediment samples at the same 3 sites in the southern lakeshore. So Elias assures me that Demira Bay, which is your 4.2 Chacombe there on the map, that's the sediment that's most related to Mbenji Island. And Mbenji Island being very rocky and having very little sediment, there's no one living there. So when we look at these kind of different results across the parallel, that's the one that we're pulling with, particularly with Mbenji Island. These were core samples. You can see an example there, taken about 60 centimetres long, and then the results that we show were then sampled at 10 centimetres along the way. One of the key questions I anticipate you asking is what are the differences in the particular years. We don't know the answer to that yet, unfortunately, for this grant, not enough money to do that analysis, but we will hopefully be looking at that in the near future. To change. Okay, so in terms of actual chemical pollutants, what Charles focused on there, we're looking at bioavailable metals. So metals that could be taken up and have a potential for toxicity in humans or fish across the waters there. This area of Lake Malawi has alluvial deposits, and that supports high levels already of manganese, iron, and aluminium as well. So we're not surprised to see that there on the left-hand side of the graphs, there are quite high levels of these different chemicals that are naturally occurring within the lake. So they're not necessarily orientated or associated with human activity per se. One thing I've learned today as well, having looked this up in the high calcium levels, is that cichlids in Lake Malawi have adapted to live in high calcium waters, which are naturally occurring in Malawi as well. So there's an interesting fact that I've learned today too. The chemicals there on the right-hand side are ones that are more associated with human activity as well. So it could be associated with agrochemicals, for example, or other kind of developments. And you can see from those, they're relatively low. And that's also associated with the fact we don't have a lot of very industrial activity around that area. I'll come back to why chemicals are important again in other areas though in a moment. When we look at the microbes, so these are looking at different organisms that exist in those sediments. So it's using sequencing that look for the DNA of these different organisms as they go through. You'll see basically the large number of stripes there mean there's a great depth and breadth of different microorganisms that are found within that core. But the most common ones being those purple and green ones that represent just common gram-negative bacteria that we would expect to find, but also importantly in terms of the one of them is the bacterioids, the indicators of fecal contamination. My background is environmental health, so that's what gets me interested, is seeing, again, that kind of human engagement, human activity, which is increasing the presence of fecal contamination, both from humans and potentially animals in that environment too. And that's supported by the fact that we see these quantities that are not represented here, but the quantities of bacteria are continually increasing over time. And that's because of our increase in population, right? Malawi's population now sits at around 20 million. I always reflect back when I first lived in Malawi in 2000, the population was around 9 million. That's huge growth in terms of population over that short period of time. Then looking at other microbiological risks, so understanding then the ones that are going to be causing problems in terms of fish survival, the marketability and use of fish as a food product as well. So we have a common fish pathogens, and Charles has been looking for their DNA in the sediment samples too. Two particular concerns there that have come up that are now commonly being seen in the Senga Bay area as well, in terms of infection in fish. So these are also using these methods to be able to monitor and understand what's going on in the water. Gives us an idea as well to be able to preempt what might be happening, to be able to look at how we can intervene and have different interventions that can hopefully reduce these risks in the future. And lastly, we've been looking at antimicrobial resistance risk as well. So there's a table there that I do not expect you to read, but the main point of that table is really just to point out that there are a huge number of resistant genomes that were found across the sediment samples that are there, particularly prevalent in the Senga Bay area, which is the highest population across the room. I think very key for us to remember about antimicrobial resistant genes is that these are not just there due to consumption of antibiotics or misuse of antibiotics, which is often the belief that the only way for us to control AMR is to look at antibiotic stewardship. We know now from the last few years and extensive work that things like heavy metals and biocides are also contributing to antimicrobial resistant genes. And so having even a small amount of antibiotic in the environment is then accelerated by these chemicals, or these chemicals can be causing the AMR to be developed as well over that time. Also associated as well with the feces that are potentially going into the water systems too, and coming out of humans. So something that is going to potentially impact, again, both the safety of the food that's coming from fish and from the lake, the safety of the water, which is often used for drinking and household use, and lastly, obviously human health in terms of transmitting and continuing to make AMR transmit throughout the environment. I think that's all my slides for now. David, back to you.
No problem. Thank you. No. Perfect. So based on this research, we have started to draft up some recommendations just based on what we've found. The caveat is that these are currently being worked through and they are working recommendations. So any thoughts or feedback would be much appreciated on these. One of our main points that we really want to make, however, is that the successes at Benji Island are a result of the collective elements of the management regime, so that the technical aspects of the regime, such as the closed season and the gear restrictions, cannot be simply isolated and applied elsewhere. They cannot be simply taken and applied throughout the lake. Some of the reasons for this relate to the first point I've got on here, on legitimacy and embeddedness. What we found in this research, and what is recurrent in other research related to participatory management and fisheries management more generally, maybe more exciting, is that technical principles, so regulations based on technical principles like gear restrictions, maximum sustainable yield, closed seasons, that might recognise ecological complexities are not quite enough to lead to successful management of fisheries. The successes at Benji are a result of the targeted technical regulations, but combined with strong leadership, proactive enforcement, long-term realisation of benefits by the resource users, by the fishers, the transparency of the regime through the ceremonies that Bryson spoke of, that generate each year information about the fishery, what's went well, what the challenges have been, and why these are implemented in the first place. And also the fact that this regime has been embedded in existing institutions and beliefs centred in the community, centred on Benji Island. What we found actually during the project was that there had been some more escalations and violence between fishers and government enforcement agencies, which really speaks to the lack of legitimacy that fishers feel towards the enforcement agents, is the lack of buy-in that they have to current enforcement issues that are not recognising their knowledge, their input, and their decisions surrounding the lake as well. Another important finding that we had was the idea of connectedness, and by this I mean the understanding of how far different management regimes connect with and reflect and are reliant on each other. When Bryson was undertaking his oral histories, part of what he found was that in Benji's sustained success, the sustained success of that fisheries management programme, has actually also been a result of the ability of fishers who usually fish at Benji Island to move to government waters during the extended closed season so that they can continue their livelihoods, they can continue to fish. So, for example, if we extended the closed season, or a blanket extension of the closed season to 4 months throughout the lake, there might actually be a negative impact on Benji Island as well, because fishers may no longer move to other waters to fish, or they might start continuing to illegally fish into those waters as well. So moving a little bit away from the binaries that we've seen in the colonial regulations, whereby you have chief fisheries and you also have the centralised fisheries, or you have the African fisheries and the non-African fisheries from the colonial perspective, really need to understand more about how those are connected closely and how these resources are shared across these regimes. Thirdly, the importance of leadership and communication, which is really clear through Benji Island. Strong leadership, as Bryson emphasised, has been crucial at Benji Island. And this centres on shared accountability and responsibilities through the Benji Island fisheries committees, as well as the transparency and communication with fisheries participants through the opening and closing ceremonies. So while the charismatic leadership of Chief Makanjira is so central to this regime, there's also that shared accountability with the committees and that sort of shared communication with the officials and resource users themselves. One of our other findings relates to support and this idea that there needs to be greater governmental support for the community management that's ongoing by not just providing legislative provisions, which we've discussed a little bit about, but also providing more tangible resources for both instructive and enforcement activities. And by instructive, I mean peer-to-peer learning between fishing communities, those who have been able to manage their stocks well and who are find empowerment through that can speak to other communities and learn. Other communities can learn from that success in those structures, but so can government officials also. But then also support for the enforcement activities through tangible resources like boats and support through prosecutions as well. Crucially though, this also includes resources for community-led science to gather and disseminate data that can inform the management decisions by communities. As Elias and Bryson both mentioned, before we undertook this project, there was sort of a general assumption that there was success at Benji Island, but there hadn't been that ecological environmental data to back that up, to sustain that. So it's a point of putting traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge and local knowledge in conversation with the scientific data as well, putting the scientific data in support of that knowledge rather than replacing or undermining that knowledge. Lastly, and maybe this is my bias as a historian, we need to have historical awareness of these resource regimes. We need to be persistently acknowledging, considering and addressing how the ideologies and beliefs driving past management regimes continue to shape present-day government practices, even as these adopt participatory language and attempt to institute new participatory frameworks. As they try to include new voices, try to include alternative perspectives, we need to understand how that long history of imposition, the long legacies of a lack of legitimacy in some cases, continues to impact on those successes. So basically saying we need history, we need historians. And now for our last slide before the Q&A, I'm going to pass back to Tracy, because I'm sure you're sick of hearing from me right now, to talk a little bit about our next steps.
This is where I'm going to commend David as PI of this project, because I've never seen an academic eke so much work out of such a small grant. And he's done an absolutely incredible job of helping to drive all of this along with our colleagues in Malawi. And I think hopefully you've managed to see the kind of, this work has tried to start looking at that whole system, appreciating that, as David said, there's not a silver bullet here. There's no one thing that's going to fix fisheries. We have to look at it from multiple different angles. And this work, in combination with other work that's been done by colleagues at Mizuni around, you know, the quality of fish coming out of the lake and how that's transported, for example, to markets, and the added value that could come from fish products, or the previous work we've done with Strathclyde at the Malawi University of Business and Applied Sciences that's looked at, you know, the behavioural indicators and determinants around water and sanitation and hygiene in fishing communities, all needs to come together, because all together they demonstrate how complex this challenge really is in dealing with fisheries across the lake. So as with all development and sustainability related issues, we have to now have this kind of bigger picture whole system approach. And as David mentioned, that needs to be co-developed, co-designed with people involved, whether those are the government officials, right down to the fishers themselves and the communities that benefit. And a big part of that, you know, talking about the clashes, is around trust and respect of each other's voices within that conversation as well. And that's something we have challenges with across the world. We have challenges with that in our own country here in Scotland, let alone elsewhere. And so that's something we want to build in. So looking forward, we are now developing an outline for a programme that would look at using a One Health approach. So one that's centred on addressing historic and socio-environmental injustices, both historically and now in the present day, looking at how we can build a future of both community-led and wider government fisheries governance. So we hope to do that through engaging with that fisheries governance. This is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding what that looks like in one area. So much more in-depth archival and oral history, ethnographic and qualitative work that would help us understand the fisheries science at the moment. Building in, here comes my bias, the environmental and public health components of that as well. So much more active sampling that allows us to see what's going on now and historically, what will potentially happen in the future with climate change that we see and how that will impact on the fisheries as well. And understanding those drivers of behaviours, those drivers of infrastructural change or lack thereof in these settings, because just like trying to change behaviours here in Scotland, we need to understand what the key triggers are, the motives might be for people to improve their sanitation, for example, or to be more likely to be accepting of longer close seasons. And we need that scientific evidence in order to inform programmes and policies as we go forward. Out of all of that, the kind of dream and the aspiration at the end of that is that we develop communications and evidence that inform those policies and programmes. They include the creative arts, different ways of communicating this. You would have seen the photographs of the closing ceremony in the slides there, really engaging in those opportunities and processes in order to share. You know, living and working in Malawi, a great admiration for how we can use drama and music and voice and poetry to be able to communicate messages effectively. And as I said, building that trust and respect between stakeholders takes time, and it can't just be taken for granted. So embedding that within whatever we're going to do to make sure we have that kind of support of what could be a context appropriate, David said, solution for Mbenji Island, not a solution for everywhere else. That it's just and equitable for everyone involved, and very importantly, that we're looking to the future and that climate resilience that needs to be there as well. Great, that's me. I'm going to hand back to David, I think, or Stuart, or someone.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to move into the Q&A now. Just if you have any questions, either on Zoom, in the room, you can ask live on Zoom or via the chat. I think that's okay as well, or ask live in the room. While we're waiting for questions, I should also plug our website, the lessonsfromlakemalawi.com, which you'll have seen in the room. We've got a little pamphlet here. Sorry for those of you online, I don't know if you can see that. But you can access this online, this pamphlet, which gives a bit of a summary of what we've talked about today and talks through this history. But also online, we have lots of resources, such as historical data that we've uploaded, reports from the Colonial Fisheries Department, as well as inquiries into the fisheries historically as well. And we're also in the process of designing some story maps, which are sort of visualising this history and these recommendations as well. So please check it out and keep an eye on it. I think it's in the chat now as well, which is appreciated.
There's one question up here, David, but it might be for Elias.
And I see Elias and Bryson are on Zoom as well, so they can come in on any questions.
On the recommended fishing net, you said only 2 inches are allowed. Does this apply to the Eutacus species because I was born within fishing?
Oh. Elias, do you want to take that question on the 2 inches restriction?
You're muted, Elias.
Sorry, Elias, you're muted if you're answering that.
All right. Thank you very much, colleagues, for the nice presentations. Of course, I've had mine there, which I think was nice as well. But I appreciate all the presentations and information that has been shared on this event. With regard to the question, if I got it clearly, the question is asking whether the 2-inch mesh size applies also to the conservation of the Eutacus species. Yeah, well, that particular regulation in terms of fishing gear dimensions pertains mostly to the conservation of the tilapias, larger sized tilapias like the jambos. In fact, it's one of the regulations which has been adapted and adopted from the research that was carried out during the British colonial regime, particularly by the scientist that David mentioned, Rosemary Lowe McConnell. So based on her work, a number of regulations were decided and enforced, particularly to properly and sustainably manage the tilapias. Why the focus was on the tilapias mostly was because the tilapias during those years were regarded as the most economically important fish species, which in fact it was during those years. Between those years and the time now, several things have happened. One of which is that the population of the tilapias, particularly the jumbo, has declined over time. Much more so in the southern part of Lake Malawi, also in Lake Malombe. David mentioned about that as well. And so that regulation, even if it was in place, does not seem to have really worked to help the conservation and even restoration of the jumbo species. So I think there is quite some need to shift attention to species that have become more economically dominant and important over the years. The jumbos and other tilapias having declined, other species have taken their place. So this includes the utakas of the copper dichromis species, which are dominant at the Mbenji Island. So the regulation about that gear dimension pertains more to the conservation of the tilapias, the chamos, unlike the utakas, because these are smaller in size. However important they are economically, but their sizes are really smaller comparative to the tilapias. So that's the answer I can provide to the question. Branson mentioned that, but of course I know it is the case, and that's the response that I can give. With regard to the utakas, the most significant regulations in terms of gear happens to be the type of gear that is allowable in the study site in Mbenji and surrounding waters, particularly in Mbenji. They do not allow very small sized gears like the mosquito nets. We know mosquito nets, and fishermen do often use that net to maximize their catches at the detriment of the sustainability of the fish stocks. So the communities spearheaded by the Chief Makanjira in Mbenji Island are particularly hateful. They don't like the usage of the smaller size gears like the mosquito nets. So that appears to be helping the conservation of the utakas in that area. But also they don't like the use of light, because fishermen have a tendency also in Lake Malawi to use light as attraction devices to bring or attract the fishes together and then scoop them off the waters. So it's a very effective strategy, but one which is also very destructive. And so the communities have realized that there is no sustainability in using that strategy of fishing, and therefore they also disallow or prohibit that type of fishing. So thank you very much. I was trying to respond to the question about the relevance to utaka fishes of the 2-inch regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Les. That's great. And just to come in on that point as well, because there's some interesting historical data from the same period, from the 1950s, about the utaka fisheries and the nets. And what happened in the 1940s and 50s was the non-African fishing firms tried to blame the African fishers for the overfishing and said they were using certain fishing gears like the Kilomira net, which is used to catch utaka. they were using that net to catch juvenile chambo, and that's what was impacting on the fish stocks. However, the researchers, the scientists, came back and just explained that that wasn't happening, that the impact of those nets on juvenile chambo was not actually that relevant to the overfishing, and it was in fact the efforts of the non-African fishers. And so from that point, you see that distinction between the Killamira net and the importance of the Utaka fisheries, and then that real focus on the chambo fisheries as well. So Elias's sort of point really speaks to that long legacy also of those different differentiations between Utaka and the chambo fisheries also. Any other questions? Please, George.
2 questions, if I may, please, David.
Yeah, please.
I wonder how supportive and bought into the local fishers in Benji Island are to the extended closed season. And also you mentioned that the successes are really due to collective elements, and so it's not a cut and paste from one community into another, but Tracy touched on ceremonial sharing and so on of the findings. I just wonder how that's being received and how it's going.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, Bryson, would you like to answer the first question perhaps on sort of what you found through the oral histories in terms of how fishers are engaging with the closed season and their sort of perceptions on that? I know that you and Elias both undertook a workshop based on these findings and these recommendations with some of the fishers and participants. So if either of you want to come in right now, that would be good.
Yeah, thank you very much. Eric, thank you very much, I think, for the question. Indeed, I think the idea of closed season, extended closed season, is very significant in the success of Benji Island. At first, it was critical among the communities because they thought that they were being punished because they are used to fishing. But later on, they appreciated, I think, the value and the benefits. And eventually, they began to comply, I think, with that regulation. Even the chief himself admitted that to get the community to accept that, it was a tall order. But now I think they have accepted, they have seen the benefits of multiple breeds, and therefore I think they have complied. Of course, there will be 1 or 2 people who would want to engage into illegal, but there is a lot of policing, as we mentioned, that they have a community policy and the fisheries, and even the actual police of Malawi are also involved, I think, in making sure that there is no illegal fishing during the closed season. So I think briefly, that's what I can say about the closed season. Yeah.
Nice. Appreciate it. Elias, would you like to come in on that at all? Just to make sure you've got time.
Oh, well, yes. Yeah, like Bryson said, the issue of closed season can be quite tricky in the Lake Malawi and other lakes in the country, in the sense that during that time, it's like the fishermen are deprived of their source of livelihood. They would want to go fishing, irrespective of the regulation that there should be no fishing during closed season. And so that's the reason why in government-controlled areas, government finds it difficult to extend the closed season beyond the 2 months, in as much as they know there would be some conservation benefits emanating from the same, but they know that there would be quite some resentment from the fishing community, bordering on the deprivation of their source of livelihood. What will they eat during that time? How will they find money during that time? And that has been a major point of concern by government. During several times in the history of management of fisheries in Malawi, the government has tried to put in place some alternative, survival, strategies for the communities, so that in so doing, we enhance compliance to the closed season regulation. So government has sometimes, brought issues like gardening or farming, providing some form of subsidies to the fishing communities so that they can divert their effort from fishing to something else. So farming, groceries, boat building, in preparation for the season where fishing is open, and other things that really would absorb fishing effort from the fishing communities and still be able to give a source of livelihood to the fishing community. So that has been a problem. And like David said, if the extent of closed season at Mbenji Island is extended in a similar manner to other areas in Lake Malawi, definitely that would result into people at Mbenji coming into conflict with their own existing regulation there of 4 months closure. Right now, the people go to government fishing areas when Mbenji Island is closed for 4 months. People can find somewhere to go and fish. However, during the workshop that we had, the people themselves were saying, no, it's possible that this closed season at Mbenji Island can be extended to other fishing areas in other parts of Lake Malawi. They were saying that it is possible, and people are more or less ready to embrace that change, and that they are promising that maybe there would be no serious, conflict as we fear them to be. That's what the people were actually saying. And with regards to the pragmatism of Chief Makanjira, the people were saying, oh, yeah, Chief Makanjira is pragmatic indeed, but his attributes as a human being are not restricted or limited to Mbenji Island alone, not restricted to Chief Makanjira alone. We also have the same, capabilities in our respective areas where we're coming from. So these are fishermen that were coming not from Mbenji itself, but in the waters that surround Mbenji under government-controlled areas. And so this is what they were saying. And therefore, I think there were suggestions that maybe more outreach to them, to the fishing communities around Mbenji Island, not necessarily at Mbenji Island, and in other parts of Lake Malawi, an outreach there about how Mbenji Island is going about the managing of their fisheries resources, because a lesson has to be learned. If you cannot learn a lesson and apply that lesson elsewhere, perhaps the value of the activities being done will not be largely appreciated. So people are saying, use the same people that have success stories at Mbenji Island to come to other areas and teach us how they are succeeding at Mbenji. We should also be able to succeed like they are succeeding. Yeah, so that's what the people were saying. So I think that we have some way to go in trying to see how we can implement perhaps not everything, but some of the lessons that we have learned on and picked from Mbenji Island. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryson, for those answers. And yeah, just to come in on the point about like $1 million question, sort of scaling up almost, or taking the lessons and applying them elsewhere. As Elise and Bryson have said, it's about how we go about doing that in terms of who are we speaking to and whose voices are we including in that consultation. So we have these findings and here's what we've found is successful, but rather than government just taking that and running with it and imposing it, we're sort of trying to avoid that scenario whereby actually what we want to do is have that peer-to-peer learning whereby fishers from Mbenji, the leadership at Mbenji can speak to other communities and sort of engage in that networking and peer-to-peer learning, but also learn from other communities what their contexts are, what they've done, sort of their success stories as well, because while Mbenji Island is such an excellent example of the successful fisheries management, it's not the only one in the lake or in the surrounding lakes. There are other examples. So it'd be nice to bring and be able to have the capacity to bring individuals together, different communities together, to share those learnings and to come up with their own sort of lake-wide plan that would be receptive to officials and fishing communities more than sort of dominated from this top-down governance that we've kind of seen mostly from the 1950s onwards. Peter, do you want to say anything on that?
No, I was just wondering, what the second question was about how was the findings received at the closing ceremony and things? Is that what the question was?
That would be interesting as well,
Yeah.
Tracy. Thanks.
Well, that wasn't the question. But maybe, I don't know, Bryson can talk a little bit, because Bryson and Elliot were like able to participate in the ceremonies and gave and had feedback with the communities as well. So maybe Bryson could give some insights from there.
Yeah. Brian, are you happy to give some sort of insights from, especially from the workshop and the ceremonies that you attended, just on some of the recommendations that were shared and the perspectives on those recommendations?
Hello, maybe. Hello, David.
Hi,
I hope you. Yeah, maybe I can just start. Then the areas can join, I think, because we're doing it together. I think the results were well received during the workshop, but at the same time, the chief kept on inviting us to the opening and closing. He could even send a reminder. In fact, just last week, he also communicated to me that we should be thinking about the closing ceremony in December. So to me, I think the communities have well received the results of the study. And I think they are geared to hear more about the developments and so on. Participating in the opening and closing ceremony is quite good because this is the opportunity where people, the subcommittee share the experiences and provide reports about what the kind of progress they made. And at the same time, I think during the opening ceremony, it's now the main committee which is in charge. They also share about illegal fishing and how people have been handled during that time. About the workshop was quite good. I think big people attended, including the director of fisheries and also so many stakeholders in the government and so on. And they all appreciated what is happening at Benji. I think the key challenge is now how to replicate the lessons from Benji to other areas, especially the extended closing period. People are still not very comfortable because they are used to fishing, but they have seen the benefits, and I think it's yet to be established on how best this can be replicated. So briefly, I think I can talk about that, but maybe areas can also come in. Yeah.
Thanks, Bryson, definitely. Elias, would you like to reflect on anything there? Just remember you're on mute. Sorry, Elias, it's okay if you don't. No, that's okay. Elias, maybe something's happened with connectivity, but just let us know and you can sort of unmute if you come back. Okay, good. Any other questions at all? Hi.
I was curious to see if there's any parallel works on the Mozambique side that can be linked into or associated works.
Yeah, so it's interesting when we started this project, and especially from the historical perspectives, there's really not that much written on the fisheries management, particularly in the lakes. To be honest, there's not much written on fisheries management historically in Africa, to be honest. There's not a great deal of historical writing on that as of yet, which is part of what we're trying to do more of. I think it would be nice if we can do more sort of cross-lakes discussions as well, but no, nothing that I can think of. But I know there's been work on the participatory management side and the challenges, so more contemporary work, which is really interesting because it basically we see some of the points that we made, the lessons, you see that replicated. So the ideas of legitimacy, leadership, support, that comes up time and time again, but so does this idea of a top-down idea of participatory management, whereby that language that's used might seem participatory and the sort of legislation that's put in place might seem to empower communities, but in practice, that's not what's happening on the ground. It seems to be, sometimes there can be capture by elites. So if there are leaders who are not as invested in the fisheries as, say, Chief Makanjira is, then they might capture some of the benefits from the fisheries, or they might not have the resources to implement the participation at all as well. So it's kind of, there's all these mixed issues and challenges, which you can see But there's that lack of historical awareness, I think, a lot of the time, that this isn't something that's happened since the 1990s. This has been happening since the colonial regimes sort of were imposed as well.
Thank you.
Elias, I see you've unmuted. Would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you very much, David. I got a question and I also got the response that Bryson provided. And I was also in the process of starting to make a contribution, but I then realized that there was a muting on the technology. Yeah, well, Bryson did say it rightly, that indeed the participants during the workshop were very positive, very receptive of our work with them and the findings that we had to present to them. In fact, some of them were saying, oh, we wish this came yesterday. Yeah, where were you all this time? So those were very encouraging remarks from the participants that included as wide a diversity of people as Bryson did indicate, the director of fisheries, also the director of planning and agriculture and environment, all these were in attendance. So they were quite happy that we're there to share with them our findings. And they did also send through us their appreciation to the finances, to the funders of the project that enabled that conversation, that interaction between ourselves and themselves. And so, yeah, they kept saying that, well, come back tomorrow. Another day, come back, please don't forget us. And that also was said by the chief repeatedly, that during close season, please don't forget to come. We'll remind you, please come. There was one thorny issue that the chief has repeatedly asked many stakeholders to offer some help, and that was how the communities can be assisted on their mobility to monitor the fisheries activities during close season and also during the time that the fishing is in progress, to make sure that there is no disobedience of the rules that are set. So they had been talking about mobility on the water, and so they had been asking the other stakeholders which were also present during the workshop, stakeholders like Refresh, which are financed by USAID. They were also asking help from other stakeholders who were also present during the workshop and who also have been present during other interactions that we've had with the communities. Mobility on the fishing, and a kind of small boat to assist them in commuting and watching over their resources around the island. The chief had asked very fervently. So this is just one thing, but it's something which has kept ringing in our minds. How can these people be helped? Perhaps other people come in to help, and so we have not followed yet. Because the other stakeholders did promise to help the communities during that workshop and even before that workshop, and we're yet to see how the communities have been assisted. The other thing that they were saying they needed help on following our workshop with them was the inadequacy of the pamphlets, which, thankful to David, we're very appreciative. You did make additional pamphlets, so many of them, and these have been taken by Bryson, who already had a trip to that side, and Bryson has shared these pamphlets with them, and several other stakeholders have also had a copy, at least, of these pamphlets. So thank you very much, David. And thanks for the funders that made this possible. Also, the people were saying, oh, but keep on telling this successful story about ourselves. Keep telling this story, not only to us, but maybe take it over to the parliamentarians that are responsible for issues of environment and fisheries, and agriculture, so that they can also appreciate how successful we have been and perhaps they can also encourage or help to encourage other fishing communities elsewhere to try to learn something from us. So yeah, they were very, very, very happy, and we were happy too that the people we came to reach with our message were positively receiving our message and encouraged us to keep on propagating this message over and over, even to other people. So this is what I can say in addition to what Bryson said in response to the feelings of the participants during the workshop that we had with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elias, for that. That's really interesting. And I'm glad to hear the pamphlets have been well received as well, which is always good to hear. And just to build on that, I think. Oh, sorry. No, please.
No, just I wonder if I could add a historical note. My name is Trevor Croft, and I worked in the National Parks Department in Malawi for 6 years in the late 70s, early 80s. Tracy mentioned the population. In those days, it was only 5.5 million, and even then, it was signs of overfishing. But there was another arm to the fisheries issue in Lake Malawi, which was the mbuna, given the local name, aquarium fish. And not many people realised that there was something like 400 different species in Lake Malawi, more than anywhere else in the world. And it was, I think, in the late 1960s that the first suggestion that these fishes needed specialist protection, because they were being fished locally without any regulation or anything, and exported to aquariums all over the world. And when I joined National Parks in 1978, I think it was, I was tasked with trying to get all strands together to get work taken forward for a national park in Lake Malawi with a specific aim of protecting cichlids, especially the aquarium ones. Now, the area that we were looking at was Chief Nankomba's area, basically from Pussy Bay north to Cape Clear, but taking in part of the southeastern arm of the lake, which was mentioned in the previous presentations as being under particular pressure. And even then, we were aware that the chambo were getting smaller and there weren't as many about, even though it was a major fish that we used to enjoy. But what we then did, and it's in a sense it made us what happened later, was to get together a working party of agriculture, fisheries, getting in the local communities. And I think that what we must bear in mind is that there was a different political situation in those days. Because the life president, Kamuzu Banda, one of the things he was particularly keen to do was to keep a lot of expatriates working in Africa, in Malawi, because at that time there wasn't a body of local universities overseas and also the only university then was Chancellor College in Zomba. And I think to a certain extent there was a suspicion that all these initiatives of conservation were being driven by expatriates and not by Malawians, and that what's the benefit for them. But by getting everybody together in this working party, we were able to come up with proposals which basically allow for the protection of the fisheries and at the same time safeguarding the livelihoods of the local fishermen. And we put together a management plan which was based on a research study carried out by the research officer in parks at that time, Richard Bell, which basically looked at the science of the fisheries, particularly in the southeast arm, but around the southern area of the lake. And eventually this led to a master plan and the designation of the Lake Malawi National Park on 24th of December 1980, which was particularly significant because it focused on the water area for 100 meters off the lake shore of those rocky areas, particularly populated by the filter fish. There were detailed proposals put forward, and it later led to the designation of the Lake Malawi National Park as a World Heritage Site, if on the basis of the protection of the fish, long before, I might add, any World Heritage Site in the UK. That was a very important step forward, But I've been back to Malawi 2 or 3 times since then, and what I'm saddened to see is that the moon stocks have been decimated. You can go across to North Queen Street to Deep Sea World, and there's a tank full of Malawi fish. And that's repeated throughout the world. And unfortunately, it looks as though they may have gone beyond the point of no return. I don't know. But the lessons I think of that, of working together, are now being repeated in Momenji Island. And what I think is significant now, especially as you've got more education and more qualification in Malawians over that 40-year period, is that the work we were doing is now being replicated. But I think there's a lot more trust in what's going on because it's being done by local people and not by the expatriate population. But I'd be interested to know if any work has been done on the fish and what the situation is in terms of control and the export of these, because obviously it's brought a lot of money into Malawi, but largely into a very small sector of the population, a lot of which I suspect has been expatriated, driven by local fishermen, getting the fish, selling to the expatriates who then sell them onto the world aquarium market, where they can fetch enormous prices.
Thank you so much for that reflection. It's so interesting to hear that, and just to, I need to get your details. I'd love to speak more. Yeah. Apologies, I am now. Because it sounds so interesting. I would love to hear more about that process of consultation with the communities at that point with the National Park. I'd love to hear more. But to go to your question, Elias, did you hear that okay? I'm just wondering if you would reflect on the current sort of stocks and control of the Mbuna fish. I just know that you would be probably best placed to answer that.
Yes, I did hear that elaborate contribution. Indeed, there is a problem with regard to the control of the export of Mbuna species. The Lake Malawi, as rightly said by the last contributor, does contain a wide diversity in terms of fish species. Such diversity has not been recorded anywhere else in the fresh waters of the world. So it's Lake Malawi, and that makes that lake very popular. It has quite unique diversity and very beautiful in appearance, and therefore making a very vital source of aquarium fish. And the companies in Malawi, for example, Stuart Grant Company, do fish the aquarium fish, and then identify markets to export this fish to. Most of these markets are in Europe, of course, and in America and Asia, and the fish are exported there. And once the fish are exported there, the people there who import this fish have learned the techniques of breeding this fish right there. So they start now breeding them, and once they're successful with that breeding, they don't see the need anymore of coming back to get additional stock. They can share among themselves through marketing, through selling the aquarium fish which they have actually successfully bred. So that poses a challenge, and this is the reason why the government of Malawi is really not very happy to see people coming and getting these fish and flying with these fish elsewhere, because they know that once the fish are flown outside, they'll be propagated, they'll be bred, and there'll be distribution of the fish right there. So I think we need very strong controls on this. The government is yet to devise revised regulations to try to intensify the regulations that border on the fishing of the aquarium fish in the Malawi, but it still remains a major source of concern. But one way in which this can be addressed is to intensify propagation of messages about the importance of conservation of these important aquarium fish species. And the Lake Malawi National Park has a museum which does part of this job right inside the Lake Malawi National Park itself. close to Nkuzi Bay, in the area of Chief Nankumba in Mangochi. But they also have another museum right at Mangochi Boma. All these museums are often engaged in exhibitions where they propagate messages of how important it is to conserve the Mbuna aquarium fish, to maximize the foreign exchange earnings for the country, and also to give maximum economic benefits for the tourism industry. So that's what I can say about what I know with regard to the aquarium industry in Malawi. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I knew you would have the answer. Thanks very much. So I think we are reaching towards the end. So I think we need to now wind up. But I just want to thank everyone, the speakers, for pre-recording and for being here as well in person. Much appreciated, and to the Scotland Malawi Partnership, especially for hosting, and to our funders who we mentioned as well. Thank them also. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Elias.
David, thanks very much indeed, and to all of our speakers in Scotland and Malawi, to Bryson, to Elias, to Tracy, and to Tracy for representing Charles's work as well. I think a really great example of Malawian and Scottish universities, Mzuzu and Strathclyde, working in dignified partnership together. Right now, 4.4 million people in Malawi are estimated to be facing food insecurity of between 2 and 6 months, depending on the district. This is due to the impacts of climate change, with the effects of Tropical Cyclone Freddy in the south and parts of the central region, and drought due to El Nino in the north. So the study of fisheries governance is a vital one. Fish stocks have long been of interest to communities in Scotland, of course, as well. And it's a brilliant thing, not only when two nations are working shoulder to shoulder in this way in such issues, but when expertise across these institutions is being brought in for a multidisciplinary treatment, as we've heard today, with historians, scientists, and policy experts working together. As David put it, scientists and data being introduced into conversation with local people for their insights, local people being heard in what strikes me as a lesson in a participatory approach. And brilliant to hear Elias represent some of the participants' approaches and concerns, saying as well that they were appreciated it so much they were asking, where were you yesterday? But also championing the thorny issue of the finances to support mobility on the lake for monitoring, and the pamphlets having been translated into, I imagine, Chichewa. And I think we've heard that it's all led to a comprehensive, a balanced, and a nuanced reflection on the successes of Mbenji and the recommendations resulting with these exciting plans for more peer-to-peer learning. A video of today's event will be put up online within the next 48 hours with links to the presentations and the project's website. Please feel very welcome to share that with anybody that you think might be interested, and also to get in touch with any members of the project team. Very brief commercial break. On the 11th of November, the Scotland Malawi Partnership's annual gathering will be held at the Advanced Research Centre in Glasgow. Anyone who can make it is very welcome to join in. All of the details are on the Scotland Malawi Partnership website. But for now, please join me in thanking all of our speakers from the universities of Mzuzu and Strathclyde for their fascinating presentations.